The Himalayas are a mountain range I've covered a great number of times on my channel, as they are host to some of the highest peaks on the planet. The Himalayas are actually geologically one of the youngest mountain ranges in the entire world, and are thought to have been formed by two continental plates, the Indo-Australian plate and the Eurasian plate, pushing against one another, which forces the terrain upwards as the plates converge. These continental plates are still actively pushing against one another, with the Indian plate, which has since split from the Australian plate, pushing inland against the Eurasian plate at a rate of between approximately 45 and 67 millimeters per year. The convergence of these continental plates has formed what is known as a thrust fault line, which is formed when older rock is pushed above younger rocks, and this fault line has been named the main Himalayan thrust as a result, and thus, the Himalayas are also still considered to be a geologically active region. For the country of Nepal, the Himalayas are like the backbone of the nation, as the many massive glaciers within them are the original source of many of the rivers that supply water throughout Asia, and the Himalayas are host to the third largest deposit of snow and ice in the entire world, behind only Antarctica and the Arctic. Furthermore, Nepal has begun to harness the power of these glacial runoff waters for hydroelectric power, the excess of which is sold off to the surrounding countries. The Himalayas are also one of the main draws for tourism in Nepal, which is the nation's largest industry and contributes to nearly 10% of the nation's gross domestic product. Some of the more unfortunate visitors to the country I've covered on my channel before, as most of them perished on the slopes of the many mighty mountains in the Himalayas. But even the many dangers that dot the slopes of these grand mountains pale in comparison to the great danger that lies in the very active fault line beneath them. On April 25th, 2015, at 11:56 a.m., at a location approximately 53 miles to the northwest of the capital city of Kathmandu, approximately 11.5 miles beneath the surface, as a result of the aforementioned continental plate convergence where the two plates pressed against each other, one side of rock suddenly slipped, which, due to the great pressure being suddenly released, caused a powerful magnitude 7.8 earthquake that began to shake the nation of Nepal, along with the neighboring nations of Bangladesh, India, and China as well. While many people are generally familiar with magnitude measurements on the Richter scale, what is lesser known is how this measurement is reached, as in order to rate the magnitude of a quake on a scale, it must be compared to something else, and so, on the Richter scale, the seismic energy of quakes is measured in comparison to the seismic energy released per ton of the explosive TNT. The seismic energy released in a magnitude 7.8 earthquake is equivalent to that of 7,558,025 tons of TNT, or equivalent to the seismic energy of 504 little boy atomic bombs, the enriched uranium bomb that was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima by the United States near the end of World War II. The earthquake itself only lasted for about 50 seconds. However, during those 50 seconds, the immense seismic energy released by the slip rippled across Nepal, causing widespread destruction in its wake. The quake's tremors reduced thousands of buildings into rubble, as the shocks of the powerful earthquake easily leveled many of Nepal's rather shoddily built buildings within seconds. One village, by the name of Barpak, which was located near the epicenter of the quake, was reduced entirely into rubble during the tremors, and many of the village's field workers who were in the fields far away from the village's buildings watched in shock from afar as their entire community, with many of their loved ones still inside the buildings, collapsed into a pile of crushed stone and twisted metal. Many of the villagers that had survived the structural collapses were trapped under the heavy debris for days, with many perishing before they could be rescued from the thick field of rubble. The fate of the village of Barpak was a similar fate shared by many of the small villages near the epicenter of the massive earthquake, as, within seconds, thousands of people lost their homes to the quake. Nepal's capital city, Kathmandu, was also hit hard by the tremors, with much of its urban architecture pancaking from the stress exerted on it by the tremors. As the dust settled, after 50 seconds of pure destruction, over 100,000 Nepalese citizens were left homeless, and local emergency services scrambled to rescue survivors and begin the long and arduous process of counting the numerous dead. This magnitude 7.8 quake caused extensive destruction beyond just Nepal's urban areas and villages, however, as the shocks also caused numerous massive avalanches on many of the enormous peaks of the Himalayas, including the world's highest mountain, Mount Everest. The huge avalanche, triggered by the tremors, thundered down Everest slopes and into the very populated base camp at its foot, where it wrought terrible destruction there upon it. This huge and deadly avalanche was caught on film by several people who were at the base camp as it rumbled down Everest, and their fear upon realizing that they are directly in the path of the avalanche's fury is palpable.
Shit. Oh! No! Fuck!
Ultimately, this enormous avalanche would claim 22 lives, which makes it the most deadly disaster in Mount Everest's history, at least as of the time of making this video. However, while the avalanche on Everest received widespread international media attention, another deadly Himalayan avalanche that wouldn't see the same attention from the international press, an avalanche that dwarfed the Everest avalanche in both scale and lives lost, also occurred on another Himalayan colossus I've covered on the channel previously, the 7,234 meter peak, Longtong Lorong. For those of you that have watched my video about the late mountaineering legend David Lama, you're probably aware of Longtong Lorong's fearsome reputation within the Himalayan mountaineering community, and a large part of why it is considered to be an extremely difficult peak to ascend is largely and simply due to its steeply slanted slopes, as the peak has significant vertical relief from the surrounding terrain, and thus summit hopefuls must navigate across razor-edge-like ridges with sharp drop-offs of thousands of meters on both sides. As is the case with many of the towering peaks along the tea house trekking routes in the Himalayas, a small village with several hundred residents, simply named Longtong, had sprung up at the foot of Longtong Lorong's majestic slanted slopes, tucked away in a small pass between Longtong Lorong and a neighboring peak, a truly breathtaking location where thousands of meters of Himalayan granite loomed into the sky above on almost all sides of it. Due to its location being a frequent stop along local trekking routes, Longtong's residents mostly relied on accommodating tourists as their main source of income, and Longtong had earned a reputation as a popular stop along these routes. However, on April 25, 2015, the magnitude 7.8 earthquake that rocked Nepal also violently shook loose an enormous quantity of snow, ice, and rock that rumbled down Longtong Lorong slopes with unparalleled ferocity. As the powerful avalanche thundered down the mountainside during the 50-second quake, the seismic waves further loosened the soil and bedrock on the mountain slopes, which, when met by the force of the incoming avalanche, was swept up and began a massive landslide so immense that the damage to the local terrain could easily be seen from outer space. Unfortunately for the residents of the village of Longtong, the village was located directly in the path of the landslide, and the entirety of the small town was swept up and obliterated by the slide, leaving scarcely a trace behind that hundreds of people had lived there, all in a matter of mere seconds. In total, 243 people who were in Longtong at the time of the landslide were killed, including 175 villagers, 41 foreign trekkers, and 27 guides and porters that accompanied the trekkers. As Nepal reeled in wake of the quake, emergency services were stretched extremely thin. However, despite this, they immediately set to work attempting to rescue those who had managed to survive, but were still encased in a tomb of rubble from the collapsed buildings. However, these rescue efforts would be hampered just minutes after the end of the initial quake by strong aftershocks, which only added further to the immense destruction, with one aftershock less than an hour after the initial earthquake, registering at a magnitude of 6.6, which is equivalent to the seismic energy of 119,786.5 tons of TNT, or the seismic energy released of nearly 8 little boy bombs. These aftershocks repeated with some regularity, with the intervals between aftershocks typically ranging between 15 and 45 minutes. These regular aftershocks would continue into the evening as emergency personnel scrambled to rescue the wounded and trapped and tally the dead, and by the late evening, officials estimated that over 6,000 people had perished as a result of the earthquake. However, unfortunately, that number would only continue to rise. The following day, April 26th, the frequent aftershocks continued on with regular frequency and increasing intensity. And on the 26th, an aftershock originating from near the epicenter of the initial quake registered at a magnitude of 6.9 and again rocked the region, causing further avalanches on Mount Everest and Longtong Larung, and tragically, further adding 200 lives lost to the steadily rising death toll of the quakes. As the resulting casualties continued to climb in the days following the initial quake, under-equipped local emergency services were stretched thin, as Nepal's rural infrastructure made attending to the numerous victims of the quakes a near impossibility. More than a week after the first magnitude 7.8 earthquake, on May 12, 2015, another powerful 7.3 earthquake rocked the region, this time with an epicenter located along the same fault line as the 7.8 quake, but a bit further to the east. And this quake again violently rocked Nepal and the surrounding countries. Although it occurred days after the initial quake, due to its epicenter originating from the same fault line as the 7.8 quake, this magnitude 7.3 earthquake was also considered to be an aftershock of the initial powerful quake. The devastation that had been wrought upon Nepal in the aftermath of the series of massive earthquakes was widespread and immense, as 2.5 million people were rendered homeless as a result of the quakes. The number of lives lost as a result of the quakes was also extensive, as thousands of people would ultimately perish in several different nations. Nepal was by far the nation most devastated by the quakes, as the official casualty count of the quakes in Nepal was 8,857 lives lost. Furthermore, 78 people perished in India, 25 in China, and a further 4 people in Bangladesh would lose their lives as a result of the quakes, which sums up to 8,964 lives lost in total. The damage done to Nepal as a result of the quakes stretched beyond the loss of structures and human lives, as the citizens of Nepal would be forced to endure a period of immense hardship throughout the country. The quakes and the widespread destruction dissuaded many tourists from visiting the country, which only worsened the locals' woes. Aid money that was intended to help rebuild many of the structures lost in the quakes was distributed by the government. However, a majority of that money would be siphoned off along the way by corrupt officials, with a study over 2 years later finding that only 12% of the intended reconstruction funds were actually used for reconstruction. Unfortunately, as is often the case in areas where people struggle daily to simply survive, Nepal saw a huge spike in human trafficking, child labor, and other crimes in the period following the quakes, while the nation slowly rebuilt in wake of the tragedy. However, the people of Nepal have persevered and have rebuilt what was once lost, reclaiming their former way of life at the feet of the Himalayan giants. Thank you all for watching.